Captain Sarah Chen pressed herself against the cold concrete wall, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the enemy soldiers could hear it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned factory compound, and she had been counting on her advanced cloaking suit to keep her invisible during this critical mission. But now sparks were flying from the damaged control panel on her chest, and the shimmering field that had hidden her from view was flickering like a dying light bulb. She cursed silently as she remembered how it happened. Just 20 minutes earlier, she had successfully infiltrated the enemy base, slipping past the outer perimeter guards with ease. Her cloaking technology was military-grade, designed to bend light around her body and make her practically invisible to both human eyes and most detection equipment. The mission briefing had been clear: infiltrate the compound, gather intelligence on the enemy's new weapon systems, and extract without being detected. It should have been a routine reconnaissance operation, but routine missions rarely stayed routine in war zones. As she had been photographing classified documents in the commander's office, an explosion from a nearby mortar attack had shaken the entire building. A piece of debris had struck her chest, damaging the cloaking suit's main processor. Now she was trapped deep inside enemy territory with 50 hostile soldiers between her and freedom, and her only advantage had just been stripped away. Sarah took a deep breath and assessed her situation. She was a highly trained special operations officer with 15 years of combat experience, but she had always relied on stealth and technology to complete her missions. Direct confrontation with 50 enemies was not something she had planned for. Her weapon inventory was limited: a silenced pistol with 2 full magazines, a combat knife, several smoke grenades, and a few pieces of basic equipment. Against 50 soldiers, these tools seemed woefully inadequate. The compound was a maze of interconnected buildings, warehouses, and maintenance facilities. She knew from her earlier reconnaissance that the soldiers were spread throughout the complex, with most concentrated near the main gates and communication center. Her extraction point was a small opening in the eastern wall where her team would be waiting, but it was nearly half a mile away through hostile territory. As footsteps approached her hiding spot, Sarah realized she had to make a choice. She could try to find another hiding place and wait for nightfall, hoping her team would launch a rescue operation, or she could take the initiative and fight her way out, using every skill and trick she had learned over her long career. The approaching voices were getting louder, and she could hear orders being shouted in the enemy's language. They were conducting a systematic search of the building. Sarah checked her watch. She had been inside the compound for 45 minutes, and her extraction window was closing fast. In 3 hours, the enemy would realize their security had been breached when they discovered the missing documents she had photographed. Once that happened, they would lock down the entire area and call in reinforcements. Her team wouldn't be able to wait much longer without risking the entire operation. The decision was made for her when a soldier rounded the corner and came face to face with her hiding spot. For a split second, both of them froze in surprise. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. In one fluid motion, she drew her knife and silenced the soldier before he could raise an alarm. She quickly dragged the body into the shadows and took his radio, rifle, and ammunition. Now she was better armed, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the missing soldier was discovered. Sarah studied the compound layout she had memorized during mission planning. The enemy soldiers were positioned in predictable patterns, following standard military doctrine for base security. Most were stationed at fixed positions, with patrol teams moving between buildings on regular schedules. If she could predict their movements and use the terrain to her advantage, she might be able to pick them off one by one without alerting the main force. Her first targets would be the isolated sentries and patrol teams. The compound had several blind spots where guards were stationed alone or in pairs, away from immediate backup. These positions were designed to provide early warning of external threats, but they also made the guards vulnerable to a skilled infiltrator working from within their perimeter. Sarah moved carefully through the shadows, using every piece of cover available. Without her cloaking suit, she had to rely on natural camouflage and timing. She observed the patrol patterns from concealment, noting how long each guard stayed at his post and when he moved to the next position. The enemy soldiers seemed relaxed and confident, unaware that their security had already been compromised. Her military training had taught her that successful stealth operations required patience, precision, and adaptability. Every movement had to be calculated, every action planned to avoid detection. She would need to use psychology as much as physical skill, creating confusion and fear among the enemy ranks while systematically reducing their numbers. As she prepared to engage the first target, Sarah reflected on the irony of her situation. The broken cloaking suit had forced her to abandon her high-tech approach and return to the fundamental skills that had made her an elite soldier in the first place. Sometimes the most advanced equipment was just a crutch, and real expertise came from years of training and experience in high-pressure situations. The compound was about to become a very dangerous place for 50 enemy soldiers who had no idea they were being hunted by one of the military's most skilled operatives. Sarah Chen was no longer invisible, but she was still deadly, and she was going to prove that human skill and determination could triumph over superior numbers and technology. The real mission was just beginning. Sarah moved like a ghost through the industrial complex, her senses heightened to their maximum potential. Every sound, every shadow, every movement in her peripheral vision was catalogued and analyzed. The first sentry stood at the corner of a storage building, casually smoking a cigarette while his rifle hung loosely from his shoulder. He was young, maybe 20 years old, and clearly bored with his routine guard duty. She approached from his blind side, using a stack of supply crates for cover. The morning breeze carried the smell of diesel fuel and metal, masking any sound of her approach. When she was within striking distance, she moved with lightning speed. The soldier never knew what hit him. Sarah quickly searched his body, taking his ammunition and radio earpiece. She could now monitor enemy communications and stay one step ahead of their movements. The radio chatter was routine check-ins between patrol leaders and the command post. Every 15 minutes, each guard position was required to report their status. She had 13 minutes before this soldier's silence would be noticed. That gave her time to neutralize 2 more targets before the enemy realized something was wrong. Her next target was a 2-man patrol moving between the warehouse buildings. They walked casually, talking quietly about their weekend plans, completely unaware of the danger approaching. Sarah positioned herself behind a maintenance shed along their patrol route and waited. Timing would be critical. She needed to eliminate both soldiers simultaneously to prevent either one from raising an alarm. As the patrol rounded the corner, Sarah threw a small stone to distract them, drawing both soldiers toward the sound. When they separated to investigate, she struck. The first soldier went down silently, taken out by her combat knife. The second soldier had just enough time to turn around before Sarah's silenced pistol ended his life. 2 more enemies neutralized, and still no alarm had been raised. Sarah dragged both bodies behind the maintenance shed and took their weapons and equipment. She now had a rifle with a full magazine, extra ammunition for her pistol, and 2 fragmentation grenades. More importantly, she had learned from their radio communications that the compound's main communication center was located in the central building, heavily guarded by 8 soldiers. The minutes ticked by quickly. Soon the command post would expect check-ins from the 3 soldiers she had already eliminated. Once they failed to respond, the entire base would go on high alert. Sarah needed to maximize the chaos and confusion during those first critical moments when the enemy was trying to figure out what was happening. Her next targets were the soldiers manning the watchtowers along the compound's perimeter. These elevated positions gave the guards excellent visibility over the entire complex, but they also made them isolated and vulnerable. There were 4 towers, each manned by a single soldier with a scoped rifle. Taking them out would blind the enemy and prevent them from coordinating their response effectively. Sarah approached the first tower from the blind side, climbing the maintenance ladder with careful, silent movements. The guard was focused on scanning the external perimeter, never imagining that the threat was already inside the compound and climbing up behind him. She reached the top of the ladder and struck before the soldier could react. One quick motion, and the watchtower was hers. From this elevated position, Sarah could see the entire compound layout. She counted the remaining soldiers and noted their positions. Most were still at their assigned posts, following normal security protocols. But she could see activity around the command center, suggesting that someone was starting to notice the missing guards. Her time was running out. She used the tower's radio equipment to monitor multiple communication channels simultaneously. The chatter was becoming more urgent. The commanding officer was trying to reach the missing patrol team, and concern was creeping into the voices of the remaining soldiers. Sarah smiled grimly. Fear and uncertainty were powerful weapons. sometimes more effective than bullets. Using the dead soldier's rifle, Sarah had a perfect shooting position to eliminate targets throughout the compound. She could pick off several more soldiers from this vantage point before they could take cover, but that would immediately reveal her location and turn the tower into a target for the remaining enemy forces. She needed to be strategic about when and how to use this advantage. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission. The command post was ordering all units to perform immediate status checks. They had realized that multiple guards were not responding to communications. Sarah had perhaps 5 minutes before the entire base erupted into chaos, and the remaining soldiers began actively hunting for the intruder. She quickly surveyed her options. The compound's fuel depot was located near the center of the complex, surrounded by several buildings where enemy soldiers were stationed. If she could create an explosion there, it would cause massive confusion and potentially eliminate multiple targets at once. The distraction would also provide cover for her to move toward the extraction point. Sarah climbed down from the watchtower and began moving toward the fuel depot. She passed close to 2 more guard positions, taking out both soldiers with quick, efficient strikes. Her count was now at 8 enemy soldiers eliminated, with 42 remaining. The numbers were still heavily against her, but she was making progress. As she reached the edge of the fuel depot area, alarms began blaring throughout the compound. The enemy had discovered some of the bodies and realized they were under attack. Soldiers began shouting orders and running to defensive positions. The easy part of her mission was over. Now came the real challenge: surviving an active firefight against overwhelming odds while fighting her way to the extraction point. Sarah checked her weapons and equipment one final time. She had enough ammunition for sustained combat, and the grenades would be crucial for creating tactical advantages. The compound was about to become a battlefield, and she was right in the middle of it. But she was no longer just surviving, she was hunting. The compound erupted into chaos as sirens wailed and soldiers scrambled to defensive positions. Sarah could hear boots pounding on concrete, orders being shouted in multiple languages, and the metallic sounds of weapons being readied for combat. The enemy knew they had an intruder, but they didn't know where she was or how many attackers they were facing. That uncertainty was her greatest weapon now. Sarah reached the fuel depot just as the first search teams began sweeping the outer buildings. The facility contained several large storage tanks connected by a network of pipes and valves. She quickly identified the main fuel line that supplied the entire compound's generators and vehicles. One well-placed explosive charge here would cripple their power systems and create the perfect distraction. For her next phase of operations, she pulled out one of the fragmentation grenades and began fashioning a makeshift explosive device using materials from her equipment kit. Her military training had included extensive instruction in demolitions and sabotage techniques. Within minutes, she had created a delayed action charge that would give her enough time to reach a safe distance before the explosion. As she worked, Sarah monitored the radio chatter from the fallen soldiers' equipment. The enemy commander was trying to organize his troops, but confusion was spreading through the ranks. Some soldiers reported seeing movement in areas where she had already struck, while others insisted they had heard gunshots from completely different locations. The psychological impact of her silent kills was creating exactly the kind of panic she needed. Sarah placed the improvised explosive device and activated the timer. She had 3 minutes to reach minimum safe distance before the fuel depot would become a massive fireball. But instead of retreating immediately, she decided to use those 3 minutes to eliminate more targets. Every soldier she took out now would be one less enemy hunting her after the explosion. Moving quickly but quietly, she approached a group of 4 soldiers who were setting up a defensive position near the motor pool. They were focused on establishing fields of fire toward the compound's perimeter. Never considering that the threat might already be behind them, Sarah used her silenced pistol to take out 2 of them before the others realized what was happening. The remaining 2 soldiers spun around, raising their rifles, but Sarah had already moved to a new position behind a parked truck. She threw her second grenade into their midst, and the explosion eliminated both targets while also destroying several vehicles. The blast would mask the sound of the fuel depot explosion that was coming in less than 60 seconds. Sarah sprinted toward the next cluster of buildings, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the fuel depot. Behind her, she could hear soldiers responding to the motor pool explosion, their voices filled with fear and confusion. Some were calling for medical assistance, while others demanded reinforcements from the command center. The fuel depot explosion came right on schedule. The blast wave knocked Sarah to the ground even at her safe distance, and the fireball rose high into the morning sky. Secondary explosions followed as stored ammunition and chemicals caught fire. The sound was deafening and smoke began pouring across the entire compound. Sarah smiled as she heard the panic in the radio communications. The enemy commander was struggling to maintain control as his soldiers reported fires, explosions, and casualties throughout the base. Power had failed in several buildings and the smoke was making visibility nearly impossible in some areas. The psychological effect was exactly what she had hoped for. But the explosion also revealed her approximate location to any remaining soldiers who were paying attention. She could hear boots running in her direction and voices coordinating a search of the area. Her count was now at 14 enemy soldiers eliminated, leaving 36 still active and looking for her. Sarah used the smoke and confusion to her advantage, moving from building to building while staying ahead of the search teams. The compound's layout worked in her favor now, providing multiple routes and hiding places. She avoided the main pathways and stuck to maintenance areas, storage rooms, and other spaces where she was less likely to encounter large groups of soldiers. Her next opportunity came when she spotted 3 soldiers trying to establish communication equipment on the roof of a warehouse. They were exposed and focused on their technical work, making them perfect targets. Sarah climbed to an adjacent rooftop and used the captured rifle to eliminate all 3 with precise shots. The rifle's scope made the shots easy despite the distance and smoke. The enemy's response was immediate and predictable. Soldiers began firing randomly into the smoke, hoping to hit the hidden sniper. Their undisciplined shooting revealed their positions to Sarah while wasting ammunition and creating more chaos. She counted muzzle flashes and noted where each shooter was located, planning her next moves accordingly. Sarah realized that the soldiers were beginning to group together for mutual protection, which made them harder to approach, but also created opportunities for more devastating attacks. A well-placed grenade or coordinated assault could eliminate multiple targets at once, but it would also expose her to return fire from the survivors. She decided to split the difference by targeting the smaller groups first. 2 soldiers were guarding the communications building, trying to restore contact with their headquarters. Sarah approached through the smoke, using sound discipline and terrain to get within knife range. Both guards were eliminated silently, and she gained access to their radio equipment. The intelligence she gathered from monitoring their communications was invaluable. She learned that the enemy commander was calling for helicopter support and additional troops from a nearby base. The reinforcements would arrive within the hour, dramatically changing the tactical situation. Sarah needed to accelerate her timeline and reach the extraction point before the compound was flooded with additional enemy forces. She also discovered that 5 soldiers had been dispatched to secure the eastern wall near her planned extraction point. This was a serious problem, as her extraction team would be walking into an ambush if she didn't clear those soldiers first. The mission parameters had changed again, and Sarah needed to adapt her strategy to deal with this new threat. As she prepared to move toward the extraction area, Sarah took stock of her resources. She had eliminated 17 enemy soldiers, leaving 33 still active. Her ammunition was running low, but she still had explosive devices and the element of surprise. Most importantly, the enemy's morale was cracking under the pressure of her relentless attacks. The smoke from the burning fuel depot created a thick haze across the compound, reducing visibility to just a few meters in some areas. Sarah moved through this gray wilderness like a predator, using the cover to close the distance on her remaining targets. The enemy soldiers were becoming increasingly desperate and disorganized, firing at shadows and jumping at every sound. Sarah's immediate priority was clearing the 5 soldiers who were moving toward her extraction point. If they reached the eastern wall before she could stop them, her extraction team would face a deadly ambush. She had to intercept them while they were still in transit, vulnerable and separated from the main force. She studied the compound's layout and identified the most likely route the soldiers would take to reach the eastern perimeter. There was a narrow passage between 2 warehouse buildings that offered the most direct path, while providing some cover from the ongoing fires and explosions. Sarah positioned herself in an abandoned office building overlooking this choke point and waited. The radio chatter indicated that the soldiers were moving in a tight formation, following standard military procedure for advancing through potentially hostile territory. Their discipline was both an advantage and a weakness. It made them more effective as a fighting unit, but it also made their movements predictable to someone with Sarah's training and experience. Through the smoke and haze, she spotted the 5-man team approaching the choke point. They were moving carefully, weapons ready, checking corners and potential hiding spots. Their leader was using hand signals to coordinate their movement, indicating a level of training and professionalism that made them more dangerous than the guards she had eliminated earlier. Sarah had 1 fragmentation grenade remaining, plus her silenced pistol and the rifle she had taken from the watchtower. The grenade would be most effective in the narrow passage, but she needed to time the throw perfectly to catch all 5 soldiers in the blast radius. Miss the timing, and some would survive to return fire and alert the remaining forces to her exact location. She waited until the entire team was committed to the passage, with no easy escape routes available. Then she pulled the pin on the grenade and threw it with the precision of a trained athlete. The explosion echoed off the warehouse walls, amplifying the blast and ensuring that the concussion would be devastating in the confined space. When the smoke cleared, all 5 soldiers were down. Sarah quickly moved to confirm the kills and collect additional ammunition and equipment. Her count was now at 22 enemy soldiers eliminated, with 28 remaining. More importantly, she had secured her extraction route and prevented the ambush that would have endangered her support team. But the grenade explosion had also revealed her general location to the surviving enemy forces. She could hear vehicles starting up and troops being redeployed in her direction. The remaining soldiers were finally beginning to coordinate their response effectively, and Sarah knew that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The enemy commander's voice on the radio was calmer now, more focused and determined. He was organizing his remaining forces into systematic search teams and establishing overlapping fields of fire to prevent further infiltration. The random panic of the early attacks was being replaced by professional military tactics that would be much harder to counter. Sarah needed to change her strategy again. The hit-and-run tactics that had worked so well in the initial phase were becoming less effective as the enemy adapted to her methods. She had to find a way to break their morale and organization before they could mount an effective counterattack. She decided to target the command center directly. The enemy commander was the key to their organized resistance, and eliminating him would throw the remaining soldiers back into chaos. The command center was located in the most heavily defended building in the compound, but it was also where the enemy would least expect a direct assault. Sarah approached the command building from an unexpected angle, using the ongoing fires and explosions as cover. The soldiers guarding the perimeter were focused on watching the approaches from the main compound area, not expecting an attack from the direction of the burning fuel depot. Their positioning created a blind spot that she could exploit. The building had 6 soldiers stationed around its perimeter, plus an unknown number inside with the commanding officer. Sarah used her rifle to eliminate 2 of the exterior guards with precise headshots, then quickly repositioned before the others could locate her firing position. The remaining 4 guards began searching for the sniper, leaving their assigned positions and creating gaps in their defensive line. Sarah exploited these gaps to get close to the building, then used her knife to silently eliminate 2 more guards who had separated from the group. The remaining 2 exterior guards were now alone and increasingly panicked, calling for backup that was tied up dealing with fires and casualties throughout the compound. She approached the building's main entrance just as one of the guards turned the corner. They came face to face at close range and both reacted instantly. Sarah's knife found its target before the soldier could raise his weapon, but the brief struggle made enough noise to alert the final exterior guard. The last guard rounded the corner with his rifle raised, but Sarah was ready. She threw the knife with deadly accuracy, striking the soldier in the chest before he could fire. All 6 exterior guards were now eliminated, but she knew that the noise had alerted the soldiers inside the building to her presence. Sarah collected weapons from the fallen guards and prepared to assault the command center itself. She had no idea how many soldiers were inside, but she knew that the enemy commander was there, along with the communications equipment that was coordinating the remaining resistance. Taking this building would effectively decapitate the enemy's ability to respond to her attacks. The building's interior was laid out like a typical military command center, with multiple rooms connected by narrow corridors. Sarah could hear voices and radio chatter coming from deeper inside the structure. She estimated that there were at least 4 more soldiers inside, plus the commanding officer and possibly technical personnel. Sarah checked her remaining ammunition. She had enough for one final assault, but she would need to make every shot count. The confined space of the building's interior would favor close-quarters combat, where her knife skills and tactical training would be most effective. She took a deep breath and prepared to enter the building. The next few minutes would determine whether she could complete her mission and reach the extraction point, or whether she would be overwhelmed by the remaining enemy forces. 28 soldiers were still hunting for her, and she was about to walk into their command center alone. Sarah entered the command building through a side door, moving with the fluid precision of a trained assassin. The interior was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting long shadows that provided excellent cover for her approach. She could hear multiple voices coming from the main command room at the end of a central corridor, along with the constant chatter of radio communications. The building's layout worked in her favor. The narrow corridors limited the enemy's ability to bring multiple weapons to bear simultaneously, while her superior close-quarters combat skills gave her a decisive advantage in confined spaces. She moved silently through the building, checking each room methodically while advancing toward the command center. In the first office, she found a communications specialist hunched over a radio console, desperately trying to establish contact with the helicopter reinforcements. Sarah approached from behind and eliminated him silently, then quickly scanned his equipment for useful intelligence. The radio log showed that help was indeed on the way. 2 attack helicopters would arrive in approximately 30 minutes. This timeline changed everything. Sarah had planned to fight her way to the extraction point gradually, picking off remaining soldiers along the route. But with helicopter support incoming, the enemy would soon have air superiority and the ability to track her movements from above. She needed to accelerate her timeline and create maximum chaos before the aircraft arrived. The next room contained 2 soldiers manning a surveillance station, monitoring security cameras throughout the compound. Sarah could see on their screens that search teams were converging on her last known position near the fuel depot. The soldiers at the monitors were so focused on coordinating the search that they never noticed her approach until it was too late. After eliminating both surveillance operators, Sarah studied their equipment more carefully. The camera system covered most of the compound, but several monitors showed static or blank screens where her earlier attacks had damaged the cameras. More importantly, she could see the positions of all the remaining enemy soldiers in real time. The tactical intelligence was invaluable. She counted 23 soldiers still active throughout the compound, plus whoever was in the main command room with her. Most were organized into search teams of 3 to 4 men each, systematically clearing buildings in the area where they thought she was hiding. None of them realized that she was actually behind their lines. In the heart of their command structure, Sarah disabled the surveillance system by destroying the main console, denying this advantage to any surviving enemy forces. Then she prepared to assault the command room itself. Based on the voices she could hear, there were at least 3 people inside, including the commanding officer whose voice she recognized from the radio intercepts. The command room had only one entrance, which made it both a fortress and a trap for whoever was inside. Sarah positioned herself beside the doorway and listened carefully to the conversation inside. The enemy commander was trying to coordinate his scattered forces while dealing with reports of casualties and equipment failures throughout the compound. She pulled the pin from a smoke grenade and threw it into the command room, then immediately followed it with a flashbang device she had taken from one of the fallen guards. The combination of smoke and disorienting light gave her the perfect opportunity to enter the room while the occupants were blinded and confused. Sarah burst through the doorway as the flashbang detonated, moving fast and shooting with deadly precision. The first soldier went down immediately, followed by a second who was reaching for his sidearm. The enemy commander was behind a desk, trying to draw his pistol while still partially blinded by the flash. "Surrender and you live," Sarah called out in the enemy's language, her weapon trained on the commander's chest. For a moment it seemed like he might comply. Then his eyes cleared enough to see that he was facing a single female soldier, and his military pride overcame his survival instinct. The commander made his choice and went for his weapon. Sarah's response was immediate and final. The command room fell silent except for the crackling of damaged radio equipment and the distant sounds of fires burning throughout the compound. Sarah quickly searched the room for intelligence, materials, and found detailed maps showing the positions of all enemy forces in the region. She photographed the documents with her equipment, adding this intelligence to the data she had already collected during her initial infiltration. The mission's primary objectives were now complete. But she still had to survive long enough to deliver the information. With the command structure eliminated, Sarah turned her attention to the remaining 23 soldiers scattered throughout the compound. Without their commanding officer's coordination, they were already beginning to lose cohesion as individual unit leaders tried to assume control with conflicting orders and strategies. She used the command room's radio equipment to monitor their communications and sow additional confusion. By transmitting false orders and contradictory information on their frequencies, she was able to redirect several search teams away from her planned escape route while causing others to waste time investigating false reports of her location. The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. The enemy soldiers were already demoralized by the constant attacks and the mysterious disappearance of their comrades. Now, with their command structure gone and confusing orders coming over the radio, discipline began to break down completely. Sarah heard arguments breaking out between unit leaders over radio channels as they disagreed about tactics and priorities. Some wanted to establish a defensive perimeter and wait for helicopter support, while others insisted on continuing the aggressive search for the intruder. The lack of unified command was tearing apart what remained of their military effectiveness. But Sarah knew that the helicopter reinforcements would change the tactical situation dramatically once they arrived. Attack helicopters with thermal imaging and heavy weapons would make her current tactics impossible. She needed to eliminate as many ground forces as possible before the air support arrived, then find a way to neutralize or evade the aircraft. Her count now stood at 27 enemy soldiers eliminated, with 23 remaining plus the incoming helicopter crews. The numbers were finally shifting in her favor, but the most dangerous phase of the mission was still ahead. She had proven that superior training and tactics could overcome numerical disadvantage, but helicopters would test those advantages to their absolute limits. Sarah gathered additional weapons and ammunition from the command room, then prepared to leave the building and continue her systematic elimination of the remaining ground forces. She had approximately 25 minutes before the helicopters arrived, enough time to significantly reduce the enemy's numbers, if she could maintain her current pace of operations. The compound was about to become an even more deadly battlefield, with Sarah caught between the remaining ground forces and incoming air support. But she had already achieved something remarkable, transforming from hunted prey into apex predator in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. Sarah exited the command building to find the compound in complete chaos. Without their commanding officer's coordination, the remaining enemy soldiers were operating in small, disconnected groups, each following their own interpretation of the last orders they had received. The breakdown in command structure had created exactly the kind of confusion Sarah needed to press her advantage. She could see 3 separate groups of soldiers through the smoke and haze. One team of 4 was searching the area near the destroyed motor pool. Another group of 5 was attempting to establish a defensive position around the main gate, and a third team was trying to restore communications equipment in a building across the compound. The scattered positioning made them vulnerable to her divide-and-conquer tactics. Sarah decided to target the communications team first. Eliminating them would prevent any possibility of re-establishing coordinated command and control before the helicopters arrived. She approached their building using the cover of burning vehicles and debris from her earlier attacks, moving carefully to avoid detection by the other groups. The communications building was a small structure, housing radio equipment and technical personnel. Through a window, Sarah could see 3 soldiers working frantically to repair damaged equipment while a 4th stood guard at the entrance. They were completely focused on their technical problems and not maintaining proper security protocols. Sarah used her silenced pistol to eliminate the exterior guard, then entered the building quietly. The 3 soldiers inside never heard her approach. Within seconds, all 3 were down, and Sarah had permanently severed the enemy's ability to coordinate their remaining forces. Her count was now at 31 soldiers eliminated, with 19 remaining. But as she prepared to leave the communications building, Sarah heard a new sound that made her blood run cold. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors approaching from the distance. The air support was arriving ahead of schedule, which meant her timeline had just been compressed dramatically. Sarah quickly assessed her options. The helicopters would have thermal imaging equipment that could detect her body heat even through smoke and cover. They would also have heavy weapons capable of destroying entire buildings to eliminate a single target. Her advantages in ground combat would be meaningless if she couldn't find a way to deal with the aircraft. She remembered seeing anti-aircraft equipment during her initial reconnaissance of the compound. There was a storage building near the eastern perimeter that contained military supplies, including shoulder-fired missiles designed to engage low-flying aircraft. If she could reach that equipment, she might have a chance against the helicopters, but first, she needed to create enough chaos and confusion to mask her movements from both the remaining ground forces and the incoming aircraft. Sarah gathered several explosive devices from the communications building and began preparing a series of diversion attacks that would draw attention away from her real objective. She placed improvised explosive devices in 3 different buildings, setting delayed timers that would create a sequence of explosions across the compound. The blast would not only eliminate any soldiers who might be hiding in those structures, but would also create multiple heat signatures that could confuse the helicopter's thermal imaging systems. As Sarah moved toward the weapons storage building, the sound of helicopter rotors grew louder and more distinct. She could now identify 2 separate aircraft approaching from different directions, exactly the kind of coordinated assault that would make her situation nearly impossible. The pilots would work together to eliminate any escape routes while maintaining constant surveillance of the entire compound. The first explosive device detonated just as the helicopters came into view over the compound's perimeter. The blast destroyed a maintenance building and sent a massive fireball into the sky, immediately drawing the attention of both aircraft. Sarah used this distraction to sprint across open ground toward the weapons storage facility. The second and third explosions followed in quick succession, creating additional distractions and heat signatures throughout the compound. The helicopter pilots were forced to investigate multiple potential targets, preventing them from focusing their attention on any single area. Sarah reached the storage building just as the aircraft began their systematic search pattern. Inside the weapons storage facility, Sarah found exactly what she needed: 2 shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles along with instructions for their operation. The weapons were military-grade equipment designed specifically for engaging helicopters and low-flying aircraft. She quickly familiarized herself with the operating procedures while listening to the helicopters circling overhead. The remaining ground forces were also taking advantage of the helicopter's arrival, finally beginning to coordinate their efforts again. Sarah could hear radio chatter as the aircraft crews communicated with the soldiers below, sharing intelligence about potential target locations and coordinating search patterns. The enemy was starting to regain some tactical cohesion. Sarah realized that she needed to eliminate the helicopters quickly before they could establish effective coordination with the ground forces. Once the aircraft and infantry began working together systematically, her chances of survival would drop to nearly 0. She prepared the first anti-aircraft missile while studying the flight patterns of the 2 helicopters through a window. The aircraft were maintaining a careful search pattern, with one helicopter focusing on the northern section of the compound, while the other covered the southern area. They were staying at medium altitude to avoid potential ground fire, but that also made them vulnerable to guided missiles. The key would be timing and positioning. Sarah needed to engage both helicopters in quick succession before the second aircraft could react to the destruction of the first. She identified the perfect moment when both aircraft would be within range but focused on different areas of the compound. Sarah moved to the roof of the storage building, carrying both missile systems. The helicopters were clearly visible against the morning sky, their thermal imaging equipment scanning the compound methodically. She could see soldiers on the ground pointing toward various buildings and communicating with the aircraft crews through radio. The first helicopter was approaching the optimal firing position when Sarah heard footsteps on the building stairs below her. Several of the remaining ground soldiers had spotted her movement and were attempting to storm the storage building. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached the roof, which meant she had to engage the helicopters immediately or lose her opportunity. Sarah shouldered the first missile launcher and acquired target lock on the nearest helicopter. The aircraft was hovering almost directly overhead, its crew probably preparing to search the storage building where she was positioned. The irony was perfect. They were hunting for her in exactly the location where she was preparing to destroy them. The missile launched with a whoosh of exhaust and smoke, streaking upward toward its target. The helicopter pilot had just enough time to see the incoming threat before the warhead detonated against the aircraft's main rotor assembly. The explosion was spectacular, sending burning debris raining down across the compound as the helicopter crashed into a nearby warehouse. The second helicopter pilot reacted instantly, pulling his aircraft into an evasive climb while scanning for the missile launch point. But Sarah was already repositioning with the second launcher, using the debris and smoke from the first crash to mask her movements. The remaining helicopter was now focused entirely on finding and eliminating her, which made it predictable. Sarah waited for the helicopter to complete its evasive maneuver and begin its attack run toward her position. The pilot was flying aggressively, probably planning to destroy the entire storage building with rocket fire, but that aggressive approach brought the aircraft within optimal range for her second missile. The second launcher fired just as soldiers burst onto the roof behind her. Sarah didn't wait to see the results. She rolled off the roof and dropped to the ground as the missile found its target. The explosion of the second helicopter was even more dramatic than the first, creating a massive fireball that lit up the entire compound. Sarah hit the ground hard but managed to roll with the impact, immediately moving toward cover as the soldiers on the roof opened fire. Burning helicopter wreckage was scattered across a wide area, and secondary explosions from the aircraft's remaining ammunition were creating additional chaos throughout the compound. With both helicopters destroyed, the tactical situation had shifted dramatically in Sarah's favor. The remaining ground soldiers were now completely isolated, with no air support and no effective command structure. More importantly, their morale was completely shattered after witnessing the destruction of what should have been their decisive advantage. Sarah could hear panic in the radio chatter as the surviving soldiers tried to comprehend what had just happened. Many were calling for immediate evacuation, while others seemed paralyzed by the realization that a single enemy operative had systematically destroyed their entire force structure. Her count now stood at 33 soldiers eliminated, the 2 helicopter crews plus the 31 ground forces she had already engaged. Only 17 enemy soldiers remained active in the compound, and most of them were showing clear signs of psychological breakdown. But Sarah knew that her ammunition was running critically low, and she had exhausted most of her explosive devices. The final phase of her mission would require different tactics, psychological warfare and strategic positioning rather than direct combat. She needed to break the will of the remaining soldiers while conserving her resources for the escape to the extraction point. The compound was now a burning wasteland of destroyed vehicles, collapsed buildings, and scattered debris. The morning sun was climbing higher, burning off the smoke and haze that had provided her with cover during the early phases of the operation. Soon, visibility would improve dramatically, making stealth movements much more difficult. Sarah checked her watch and calculated the time remaining until her extraction window closed. She had accomplished the impossible, single-handedly neutralizing a force of 50 enemy soldiers. But the mission wouldn't be complete until she successfully deliver. The compound had been transformed into a battlefield graveyard, with Sarah as its sole surviving predator. Smoke rose from multiple fires, twisted metal lay scattered across the ground, and the remaining 17 enemy soldiers were scattered in small groups throughout the complex, their discipline completely shattered by the systematic destruction of their forces. Sarah moved through this devastation like a ghost, using the wreckage and debris as cover while she hunted down the final survivors. Her ammunition was critically low, just 6 rounds remaining in her pistol and no rifle rounds, but her psychological warfare had been so effective that many of the enemy soldiers were too terrified to fight. Effectively, she could hear them on the radio, their voices filled with panic and desperation. Some were pleading for permission to retreat, while others were convinced they were under attack by an entire special forces team. None of them could believe that a single operative had caused this level of destruction. Sarah's first targets in this final phase were a group of 3 soldiers who had barricaded themselves in a maintenance shed near the compound center. They were armed but paralyzed by fear, firing randomly at shadows and jumping at every sound. Sarah approached their position carefully, using the psychological pressure she had built up throughout the morning. Instead of attacking directly, she began making noise around their perimeter, throwing stones, scraping metal against concrete, and creating the impression of multiple attackers surrounding their position. The soldiers inside became increasingly panicked, wasting ammunition on imaginary threats while revealing their exact location and weapon status through their radio communications. When their ammunition ran low and their nerves were completely frayed, Sarah made her move. She approached the shed silently and called out in their language, "Surrender now and live. Continue fighting and join your dead comrades." The psychological impact was devastating. All 3 soldiers immediately threw down their weapons and stumbled out with their hands raised. Sarah zip-tied their hands and moved on to the next group, leaving the captured soldiers behind. She had no intention of killing prisoners, but she also couldn't afford to have them rejoin the fight if they managed to free themselves. The capture rather than killing of these soldiers would send a powerful message to the remaining enemy forces about the possibility of survival through surrender. Her next targets were 2 snipers, who had positioned themselves in a partially collapsed building, trying to cover the eastern approach to the extraction point. They were professional soldiers, better disciplined than the others, and they represented a real threat to her escape route. But they were also isolated and cut off from any support. Sarah used her knowledge of their position to approach from an unexpected angle, climbing through the rubble of an adjacent building that had been damaged in the earlier explosions. The snipers were focused on watching the ground approaches and never considered that someone might attack them from above through the damaged ceiling. She dropped into their position from overhead, landing between both soldiers before they could react. Her combat knife eliminated one sniper instantly, while the other turned to engage her in close combat. The fight was brief but intense, ending when Sarah's superior hand-to-hand combat training overcame the enemy soldier's size advantage. With the sniper threat eliminated, Sarah's path to the extraction point was much clearer. She could see the eastern wall through the smoke and debris, and beyond it lay the safety of friendly territory. But 12 enemy soldiers still remained active in the compound, and several were positioned between her current location and her escape route. Sarah decided that the psychological warfare approach that had worked so well with the barricaded soldiers could be scaled up to break the remaining enemy forces completely. Instead of hunting down each soldier individually, she would create the impression of an overwhelming assault that would cause mass surrender or retreat. She gathered materials for several noise-making devices from the wreckage around her: metal, objects that could be dropped to create loud crashes, containers that could be filled with debris and thrown to simulate explosions, and other items that would create the acoustic signature of a large-scale attack. Moving systematically through the compound, Sarah positioned these devices at key locations and activated them in sequence using timers and tripwires. The result was a coordinated symphony of crashes, bangs, and simulated combat sounds that echoed throughout the complex from multiple directions simultaneously. The effect on the remaining soldiers was immediate and decisive. Radio chatter exploded with reports of attacks from all directions, calls for help and demands for immediate evacuation. The enemy forces were convinced they were surrounded by a superior force and began abandoning their positions to retreat toward the main gate. Sarah watched from concealment as 8 of the remaining 12 soldiers broke cover and ran toward the compound's exit, abandoning their weapons and equipment in their haste to escape. They had been completely broken by the psychological pressure and no longer posed any threat to her mission. The final 4 soldiers were made of sterner stuff, maintaining their positions despite the apparent overwhelming assault. Sarah could see them through her binoculars, still trying to coordinate a defense of the compound's critical areas. These were professional soldiers who wouldn't break easily, but they were also the last obstacles between her and successful extraction. Sarah approached the final confrontation with careful planning. She had 3 rounds remaining in her pistol, 1 knife, and her extensive training in close-quarters combat. The 4 soldiers were positioned in 2 teams of 2, covering the most likely approaches to the extraction point. Using the cover provided by the ongoing noise and confusion, Sarah approached the first team from behind. They were focused on watching for threats from the direction of the simulated attacks, never suspecting that the real threat was approaching from their rear. Her knife eliminated 1 soldier silently, and her pistol took out the second before he could raise an alarm. The final 2 soldiers were positioned in a defensive position with excellent fields of fire covering the eastern wall. A direct assault would be suicidal, but Sarah had one final psychological weapon to deploy. Using the radio equipment she had captured earlier, She broadcast a surrender demand in their commanding officer's voice, which she had recorded during her assault on the command center. The fake order was perfectly timed and executed, coinciding with a lull in the simulated combat sounds. Both soldiers, already shaken by the destruction around them and the apparent loss of their entire unit, accepted the surrender order without question and laid down their weapons. Sarah emerged from cover as the last two enemy soldiers walked away from their positions with their hands raised. She had achieved the impossible, single-handedly neutralizing all 50 enemy soldiers through a combination of superior tactics, psychological warfare, and sheer determination. As she approached the extraction point, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. Her broken cloaking suit had forced her to rely on fundamental military skills that no technology could replace. She had proven that training, experience, and adaptability were more valuable than any advanced equipment. The eastern wall came into view through the clearing smoke, and beyond it Sarah could see her extraction team waiting in position. The mission was complete, the intelligence secured, and against all odds she was going home. Captain Sarah Chen had written a new chapter in special operations history, demonstrating that sometimes the most low-tech approach was also the most effective. Add the intelligence she had gathered to her support team,